Man, we just got raped. Sometimes I hate playing with these people. Hello, Arthur. Lose again. Nothing new there. Shelly. I don't know. I think I might want to do her own heists. What the hell? Oh, what is Nita doing? Oh, these people. Oh, they're killing me. Really killing me. I'm about to go back 7 days to die. Be better off playing that. Nothing better to do. Of course, BB's gonna sit there and do nothing. Let's see here. Okay, so that doesn't do it. Oh, I guess it's not gonna launch anymore. Huh. Hmm. Let me see what the update's about. Bug fixes and improvements. Bookcase is paintable. Terrain at lowest or low quality reduces shader layer. Backpack friction and bounce settings. Backpack logging was added. Flying mode can now move faster. Trader Jen is now has her own unique voice. Okay. Alright. What we got? My inventory, sand and stone. I need, I don't know, what night is it? 18. So we got a couple more days till a blood moon. You can make wet concrete blocks. Let's see. Missing a block up there, but it's okay. And we got that. Need this. We don't need that. Yeah. Put that in, put that in, put that in. Put the machete in. That's a junk ammo turret. And put that in. Where's my... That's right there. What do we got here? Chemistry station. Awesome. We can make about 400 of that. And a bicycle. This concrete mix. And got 2 waters. Yeah, I got more water. Okay. Do need some more food. I got plenty of snow. And their junk turret. Put that in there. Put that scrap metal there. Put the pickaxe down here. Put the chemistry station there. Alright, what the fuck was it again? Let's see, modify. 23, 38. No. What? Did it really just add it to it? That's a lot of shit I need just to make that 4x4. Alright, so we don't need the spikes, so we can put them in there. Shotgun shells, don't need that. That's gas. Make some grenades. What is this one? Cable guys never made it challenge. Yay, all this paper and coal. Is it done? No, it's not. Oh, I got a mini bike too, looks like. see. Don't need that. Don't need the rotting flesh either. There's some more junk in the turret, which I'll put somewhere else. %. What? Wow. Okay. That was something different. Those are oil, I think. Huh, it's a snake. Gunpowder on a short bus, huh? That's not strange at all. I'll take that. Need a sewing kit. More gunpowder. Really? 3 shots? What do I got? Only $14. I can't buy any of that shit. Oh, fuck. That's a bear. Where the fuck did it go? There's a dog over there, too. Fuck, I just missed that shot. Alright, bear, where are you gonna come out of? I hear you, motherfucker. I just don't see you. Ah, there you are. Ooh. Ooh. Missed that shot. Ow. Fucker, you hit me. Ooh. Did I not even hit him? Yeah, that hit him. Let's do it again. Really? There we go. Drop, motherfucker. That's right. Cobblestone rocks. Alright. Go in here, finish looting. What was that now? Oh, that's cement. Take that. Need to. repair kits. Run over the dog. Ugh. Dodge the shit. Fuck. All these abandoned cars out in the middle of a field. Ugh, damn it. Ugh. Didn't want to hit that. Yeah, still there. Two snakes in front of me. I need to kill that for the meat. Fuck. Need to drop that guy. And I think he's dead. Alright, where were the snakes at again? Missed him. Oh, and I'm out. Fuck. Alright. Well, we're gonna do it this way. Fuck, do I got the ammo in the fucking... I wonder. I probably did put it in there. Like a dumbass. Alright, what do we got in here? Blunderbuss, no wonder. Alright, let's go get the snake. And I may put the knife in there too, so we'll just craft a new one. Oh yeah? Ah, there you are. Oh, missed you. Oh yeah, dog over there. Really? I know I heard your ass. What are we looking at? Oh. Ow! Oh, it's another bear. Get me. Another backpack. Ow, fucker. There's a snake. Come back here, I want your meat. Ooh. Fuck out of there. I was gonna collect some more oil. We gotta loot that place. Ooh. Get off of me, you stupid birds! I don't think I got antibiotics at the house. That was fucking weird. That was a weird ass glitch. Let's see, nothing in there, looks like. And we got one here. We'll use. We got an egg in there, so let's put the meat in here. Oh, I got a lot of raw meat. We put sand in there. We can put rotting flesh in there too. The bones. We can put 8 in there. Need the sand and the stone and the cement. Fuck out of my house. Alright, let's go scrap this. No, we'll just drop it. It might despawn. Put that in there. We got 2 eggs. Do I have a mining helmet on? No, I do not. Actually, I think hides in here, so we put that in there. That needs smelted. So let's keep it. No, we want that in there, so we'll turn that on. I need more stone. Put that in there. Put the animal fat in there. I don't know if I actually got cobblestone anywhere. I don't think I do. That's silver nuggets. More crushed sand. There is a flashlight, so I guess I can use that. Go look for fucking some more rocks to destroy. Let's see, sewing kits. That does not look like it's in here. The money's in there. The pain pills in. The lock picking. Do I have any empty jars? Don't look like it. So I can smelt that. Feathers. Don't look like there's any in here. There we go. Take that broken glass because we'll smelt that a lot. Smelt this too. There's no junk turret, which I'll use on Fortnite. There we are. I can go up there. Put that in there. I know I saw the nitrate somewhere. Take that out. There's some cobblestone. Those. Maybe I don't have any nitrate. What is this? Raw diamond. I swore I had some nitrate somewhere. Guess I don't. Yeah, dude, it's right there. Plastic is, yep, right there. Duke coins, I don't even know where I'm putting them. One of these chests. Take you out of there. Don't see anything in there. Don't see them in there either. They're in there? I don't think they are. No. Maybe I don't have any more. I'll turn that into that. I need that flashlight though. Oh yeah, I want to smelt this. Fuck, I didn't want to pick that up. I want to go in here, we'll pull that out. Put the concrete in. Put the cement in because I don't have any more stone. Put the gunpowder in. Put the paper in. And need to grab that flashlight. Really? Then you get back up. What the fuck? Huh, that looks like a stone right across there. Really? Where do you come from? You just need to die. And you're dead. Alright. I might die now, but I need stone. right there. Moon is so bright. There's cement, crushed sand, and the concrete is, I don't know. Sure, it was put in here. We want that in here. Put that down there, because that'll be used on the floor. Maybe I don't have it in here. I didn't use it. It should be in there. Oh, there it is. Go back up here. Take that. I just limited it. Nope, right there. Alright, we got 1 point. Use heightened sentence to take less damage from traps. Animal tracker. And in order to get this, you need level 3. I think I was going intelligence, maybe? Level 6. Plaster cast, cooking pot, pressure plate mine, oil cheaper, and gasoline. Wow. That was just a wandering horde. And they just fucked everything up over here. They didn't drop anything though. More concrete. And we need more crushed sand. We need more cement. That's what it is. Alright, go back to here. So running gun, no. I was working on something that's living off the land, which is harvest 2 items. Farm plot. I do need to get this up. Oh, shit. I need some caffeine. I need to wake up. Oh shit. Let's see here. Actually, let's bring the laptop. Laptop back up over here. And then get it back on the charger. Minimize that, close that. Let's see. Alright, so let's go here, here. Minimize that, go back to here. Okay, so desktop. Actually, let's see. Close that out. Open this up.
communications. That's the definition of pressure. Now, Ukraine, the president's lawyers say, didn't know that Trump was withholding the security assistance until it was public. Many witnesses have contested that, including the open statement by Olena Zergal, who was then the deputy foreign minister of Ukraine, that they knew about the president's hold on the security matters. And in the end, everyone knew it was public. And after it was, Ukraine did relent and schedule that testimony. Fourth, they said no witnesses said security was conditioned on the investigations. Not so. Mulvaney, we had other witnesses talking about the shakedown for the security assistance. But the important thing is that you can get a witness who talked to the president firsthand about what the president thought he was doing. Ultimately, of course, the funds, or at least some of them, were released. But
So
the White House
what we
knew
got here?
that the
Need
president
more.
promised 3 different
Need more
times.
stuff still.
Still has not occurred. So, and we still don't have the investigation
Put
of
that in, put that in.
the Bidens. Getting caught doesn't mitigate the wrongdoing. The president's unrepentant, and we fear he will do it again. Now, the Independent Government Accountability Office concluded that the president violated federal law when he withheld that aid. That misconduct is still going on. All the aid has not yet been released. And finally, I'd just like to say there's been some confusion, I think. I'm sure not intentional. But the president surely does not need the permission of his staff about foreign policy. That information is offered to you as evidence of what he thought he was doing. And he did not appear to be pursuing a policy agenda. He appeared from all the evidence to be pursuing a corruption of our election that's upcoming, a high crime and misdemeanor that requires conviction. And
Democrat.
I yield back.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The senator from Arkansas.
I send a question to the desk for the President's Counsel on behalf of myself and Senators Bozeman, McSally, Blackburn, Kennedy, and Toomey.
Senators asked the President's Counsel, did the House bother to seek testimony or litigate executive privilege issues during the month during which it held up the impeachment articles before sending them to the Senate?
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, no, the House did not seek to litigate any of the privilege issues during that time. In fact, they filed no lawsuits arising from this impeachment inquiry to seek to contest the bases that the Trump administration gave for resisting the subpoenas, the basis for why those subpoenas were
The scrap
invalid.
metal.
And when litigation was filed by one of the subpoena recipients, that was Dr. Charles Kupperman, the Deputy National Security Advisor, he went to the court and sought a declaratory judgment saying, President's told me I shouldn't go. I have a subpoena from the House saying I should go. Please, courts, tell me what are my obligations. And that was filed, I believe, around October 25th. It was towards the end of October. Very shortly, within a few days, the court had set an expedited briefing schedule and scheduled a hearing for December 10th that was supposed to hear both preliminary motions to dismiss, but also the merits issues. So they were going to get a decision after a hearing on December 10th that would go to the merits of the issue. The House managers withdrew the subpoena. The House of Representatives decided they wanted to moot out the case so they wouldn't get a decision. So no, the House has not pursued litigation to to get any of these issues resolved. It's affirmatively avoided getting any litigation. And that seems to be, at least in part, based on, if you look at the House Judiciary Committee report, their assertion that under the sole power of impeachment assigned to the House believes that the Constitution assigns, I believe the exact words are, it gives the House the last word, something to that effect. And I mentioned this the other day. This is the new constitutional theory that because they have the sole power of impeachment, in their view, it's actually the paramount power of impeachment. And all other constitutionally based privileges or rights or immunities or roles even of the other branches, both the judiciary and the executive, fall away. And there is nothing that can stand in the way of the House's power of impeachment. If they issue a subpoena, the executive has to respond. And it can't raise any constitutionally based separation of powers concerns. If you do, that's obstruction. The courts have no role. The House has the sole power of impeachment. And that's a very dangerous construct for our Constitution. It suggests that once they flip the switch onto impeachment, there's no check on their power, on what they want to do. And that's not the way the Constitution is structured. The Constitution requires, when there are interbranch conflicts, that there be an accommodation process, that there be attempts to address the interests of both branches. And the House has taken the position, and in other litigation, the McGahn litigation, they're telling the courts are the only way to resolve these issues. And they brought that case in August. They already have a decision from the district court. They have an appeal in the D.C. Circuit. It was argued on January 3rd. A decision could come any day. That's pretty fast for litigation. But they've decided in this impeachment they don't want to do litigation. And again, it's because they had a timetable. One of the House managers admitted on this floor they had to get the president impeached before the election. They had no time for the courts, for anyone telling them what the rules were. And they had to get it done by Christmas, and that's what they did. And then they waited around for the month before bringing it here. And I think that shows you what's really behind the claims of, oh, it's urgent, then it's not urgent. It's urgent when it's our timetable to get done by Christmas. It's not so urgent when we can wait for a month because we want to tell the Senate how to run things. It's all a political charade. And that's part of the reason, a major reason, that the Senate should reject these articles of impeachment. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Justice,
The senator from New Mexico.
thank you for the recognition, Mr. Chief Justice. I send a question to the desk.
The question is for the House managers. Please address the President's counsel's argument that House managers seek to overturn the results of the 2016 election and that the decision to remove the President should be left to the voters in November.
Nobody has nothing to say about that.
Thank you for the question. First I just want to respond to something counsel just said. 9 months is pretty fast for litigation in the courts. Sadly, I agree with that. 9 months is pretty fast in the McGahn case, and we still don't have a decision yet. And what's more, that's the very case in which they're arguing, as I quoted earlier, that Congress has no right to come to the courts to force a witness to testify. So here we are 9 months later in that litigation that they said we're compelled under the Constitution to bring, and they're saying in court you can't bring this, and it's 9 months and we still don't have a decision. I think that tells you just where they're coming from. It all goes back to the President's directive, fight all subpoenas, and they are. Nixon was going to be impeached for far less obstruction than anything that Donald Trump did. Now, the argument Well, if you impeach a president, you are overturning the results of the last election and you're tearing up the ballots in the next election. Okay, if that were the case, there would be no impeachment clause in the Constitution. Because by definition, if you're impeaching a president, that president is in office, has won an election. Clearly, that's not what the founders had in mind. What they had in mind is if the president commits high crimes and misdemeanors, you must remove him from office. It is not voiding the last election, it is protecting the next election. Indeed, the impeachment power was put in the Constitution not as a punishment, that's what the criminal laws are for, but to protect the country. Now, if you say you can't impeach a president before the next election, what you're really saying is you can only impeach a president in their second term. Okay, if that were going to be the constitutional requirement, the founders would have put in the Constitution, a president may commit whatever high crimes and misdemeanors that he wants as long as it's in the first term. That is clearly not what any rational framer would have written, and indeed they didn't. And they didn't for a reason. The founders were concerned that, in fact, the object of a president's corrupt scheme might be to cheat in the very form of accountability that they had prescribed, the election. So the council has continued to mischaracterize what the managers have said. We're not saying that we had to hurry to impeach the president before the election. We had to hurry because the president was trying to cheat in that election. And the position of the President's Council is, well, yes, it's true that if a president is going to try to cheat an election, by definition, that's prior to their re-election. By definition, that's going to be proximate to an election. But, you know, let the voters decide, even though the object is to corrupt that vote of the people. That cannot be what the founders had in mind. And one of the things I said at the very open of this proceeding is, yes, we're to look to history. Yes, we're to try to divine the intent of the framers, but we are not to leave our common sense at the door. The issue isn't whether this is his first term or his second. It isn't whether the election is a year away or 3 years away. The issue is, did he commit a high crime and misdemeanor? Is it a high crime and misdemeanor for a president of the United States to withhold hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to an ally at war to get help, illicit foreign interference in our election? If you believe that it is, it doesn't matter what term it is. It doesn't matter how far away the election is. Because that president represents a threat to the integrity of our elections, and more than that, a threat to our national security. As we have shown by withholding that aid, and I know the argument, no harm, no foul, we held aid from an ally at war. We sent a message to the Russians when they learned of this hold that we did not have Ukraine's back. We sent a message to the Russians as Zelensky was going into negotiations with Putin to try to end that war, that Zelensky was operating from a position of weakness because there was a division between the President of the United States and Ukraine. That's immediate damage. That's damage done every day. That damage continues to this day. The damage the president does in pushing out the Russian conspiracy theories were identified during the House proceedings, and we've heard it in the Senate, as Russian intelligence propaganda. The danger the president poses by taking Vladimir Putin's side over his own intelligence agencies, that's a danger today. That's a danger that continues every day he pushes out this Russian propaganda. The framers, if they meant impeachment only to imply in the second term, would have said so, but that would have made the Constitution a suicide pact. That's not what it says, and that's not how you should interpret it.
The senator from Ohio?
Yes.
Thank you. Question is directed to counsel for the president. Given that impeachment proceedings are privileged in the Senate and largely prevent other work from taking place while they are ongoing, please address the implications of allowing the House to present an incomplete case to the Senate and request the Senate to seek testimony from additional witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, Senators. I think this is one of the most important issues that this body faces, given these calls to have witnesses, because the House managers try to present it as if it's just a simple question: how can you have a trial without witnesses? But in real litigation, no one goes to trial without doing discovery. No one goes to trial without having heard from the witnesses first. You don't show up at trial and then start trying to call witnesses for the first time. And the implications here in our constitutional structure for trying to run things in such an upside down way would be very grave for this body as an institution. Because as the senator's question points out, it largely prevents this chamber from getting other business done as long as there is a trial pending. And the idea that the House can do an incomplete job in trying to find out what witnesses there are, having them come testify, trying to find out the facts, just rush something through and bring it here as an impeachment, and then start trying to call all the witnesses, means that this body will end up taking over that investigatory task. And all of the regular business of this body will be slowed down, hindered, prevented while that goes on. And it's not a question of just one witness. It's not a question, a lot of people talk right now about John Bolton, but the president would have the opportunity to call his witnesses just as a matter of fundamental fairness. And there would be a long list of witnesses. If the body were to go in that direction, it would mean this would drag on for months and prevent this chamber from getting its business done. There's a proper way to do things and an upside down way of doing things. And to have the House not go through a process that is thorough and complete, and to just rush things through in a partisan and political matter and then dump it onto this chamber to clean everything up, is a very dangerous precedent to be set. As I said the other day, whatever is accepted in this case becomes the new normal. If this chamber puts its imprimatur on this process, then that's the seal of approval for all time in the future. And if it becomes that easy for the House of Representatives to impeach a president of the United States, don't attempt to subpoena the witnesses, never mind litigation, it takes too long. But then leave it all to this chamber. And as I said the other day, remember, what do we think will happen if some of these witnesses are subpoenaed now that they never bothered to litigate about? Then there'll be the litigation now, most likely. And then that will take time while this chamber is still stuck sitting as a court of impeachment. That's not the way to do things. And it would forever change the relationship between the House of Representatives and the Senate in terms of the way impeachments operate. So I think it's vitally important for this chamber to consider what it really means to start having this chamber do all that investigatory work, how this chamber would be paralyzed by that, and is that really the precedent? Is that the way this chamber wants everything to operate in the future? Once you make it that much easier, and we've said this on a couple of different points, both in terms of the standards for impeachable offenses, but also in terms of the process that's used in the House. You make it really way too easy to impeach a president, then this chamber is going to be dealing with that all the time. And as Minority Leader Schumer had pointed out, at the time of the Clinton impeachment, he was prophetic. As White House counsel pointed out the other day, once you start down the path of partisan impeachments, they'll be coming again and again and again. And if you make it easier, they'll come even more frequently. And this chamber is going to have to spending a lot of time dealing with impeachment trials and cleaning up incomplete, half-baked procedures, rushed partisan impeachments from the House, if that's the sort of system that's given your imprimatur here. And that's a very important reason for not accepting that procedure and not trying to open things up now when things haven't been done properly in the House of Representatives. Thank you.
So, the Senator for Delaware.
Chief Justice, I send the question to the desk.
question is for the House managers. Some have claimed that subpoenaing witnesses or documents would unnecessarily prolong this trial. Isn't it true that depositions of the 3 witnesses in the Clinton trial were completed in only 1 day each? And isn't it true that the Chief Justice, as presiding officer in this trial, has the authority to resolve any claims of privilege or other witness issues without any delay?
Mr. Chief Justice, the answer is yes. What is clear, based on the record that was compiled by the House of Representatives, where up to 5 depositions per week were completed, that this can be done in an expeditious fashion. It's important to note that the record that exists before you right now contains strong and uncontroverted evidence that President Trump pressured a foreign government to target an American citizen for political and personal gain as part of a scheme to cheat in the 2020 election and solicit foreign interference. That is evidence from witnesses who came forward from the Trump administration, including individuals like Ambassador Bill Taylor, West Point graduate, Vietnam War hero, including individuals like Ambassador Sondland, who gave $1 million to President Trump's inauguration. Respected national security professionals like Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, as well as Dr. Fiona Hill. 17 different witnesses, Trump administration employees, troubled by the corrupt conduct that took place as alleged and proven by the House of Representatives. But to the extent that there are ambiguities in your mind, this is a trial. A trial involves witnesses. A trial involves documents. A trial involves evidence. That is not a new phenomenon for this distinguished body. The Senate in its history has had 15 different impeachment trials. In every single trial, there were witnesses. Every single trial. Why should this president be treated differently, held to a lower standard at this moment of presidential accountability? And in fact, in many of those trials, there were witnesses who testified in the Senate who had not testified in the House. That was the case most recently in the Bill Clinton trial. It certainly was the case in the trial of President Johnson. 37 out of the 40 witnesses who testified in the Senate were new. 37 out of 40. Why can't we do it in this instance? When you have such highly relevant witnesses like John Bolton, who had a direct conversation with President Trump, indicating that President Trump was withholding the aid because he wanted the phony investigations. Counsel has said the greatest invention in the history of jurisprudence for ascertaining the truth has been the vehicle of cross-examination. Let's call John Bolton. Let's call Mick Mulvaney. Let's call other witnesses, subject them to cross-examination, and present the truth to the American people.
Mr. Chief Justice. The senator from Texas.
Chief Justice, I have to send a question to the desk.
Thank you. Senator Cornyn asks counsel for the president, what are the consequences to the presidency the president's constitutional role as the head of the executive branch, and the advice the president can expect from his senior advisors if the Senate seeks to resolve claims of executive privilege for subpoenas in this impeachment trial without any determination by an Article III court.
Mr. Chief Justice, thank you, Senator, for the question. The Supreme Court has recognized that the confidentiality of communications with the president is essential. Keeping those communications confidential is essential for the proper functioning of government. In Nixon versus United States, the court explained that this privilege is grounded in the separation of powers and essential for the functioning of the executive. For this reason, in order to receive candid advice, the president has to be able to be sure that those who are speaking with him have the confidence that what they say is not going to be revealed, that their advice can remain confidential. If it's not confidential, they would temper what they're saying. They wouldn't be candid with the president. And they wouldn't be able, the president then would not be able to get the best advice. And it's the same concern that underpins the deliberative process aspect of executive privilege. Even if it's not a communication directly with the president, if it's the deliberative process within the executive branch, people have to be able, before coming up with a decision, to discuss alternatives, to probe what other ways might work to address a problem, and to discuss them candidly and openly, not with the feeling that the first thing they say is going to be on the front page of the Washington Post the next day. Because if you don't have the confidence that what you're saying is going to be kept confidential, you won't be candid, you won't give your best advice, and that damages decision making. That's bad for the government, and it's bad for the people of the United States, because it means the government and the executive branch can't function efficiently. So there is a critical need for the executive to be able to have these privileges and to protect them. And that's why the Supreme Court recognized that in Nixon versus United States and pointed out that there has to be some very high showing of need from another branch of government if there's going to be any breach of that privilege. And that's why there is an accommodations process, while the courts have said that when the Congress, when the legislature seeks information from the executive, and the executive has confidentiality interests, both branches are under an obligation to try to come to some accommodation to address the interests of both branches. But it's not a situation of simply the Congress is supreme and can demand information from the executive, and the executive must present everything. And the courts have made that clear, because that would be damaging to the functioning of government. And so here in this case, there are vital interests at stake. And, you know, in one of the potential witnesses that the House managers have raised again and again is John Bolton. John Bolton was a national security advisor to the president.
Come on.
He has all of the nation's secrets from the time that he was the national security advisor, and that's precisely the area, the field, in which the Supreme Court suggested in Nixon versus United States there might be something approaching an absolute privilege of confidentiality in communications with the president, the field of national security and foreign affairs. That's the crown jewels of executive privilege. And so to suggest that the national security advisor, well, we'll just subpoena him, he'll come in, and that'll be easy, there won't be a problem. That's not the way it would work, because there's a vital constitutional privilege at stake there. And it's important for the institution of the office of the presidency, for every president, to protect that privilege. Because once precedents start to be set, if one president says, well, I won't insist on the privilege then, I'll let people interview this person, I won't insist on it, that sets precedents. And then the next time, when it's important to preserve the privilege, the precedent is raised, and the privilege has been weakened, and it's forever weakened, and that damages the functioning of government. So this is a very serious issue to consider. It's important that the Supreme Court has made clear for the proper functioning of the executive branch, for the proper functioning of our government, and there will be grave issues raised attempting to have a national security advisor of the president come under subpoena to testify. And that would all have to be dealt with And that would take some time before things would continue. Thank you.
Counsel,
Oh my god, another
the
fucking
senator from
bird.
Hawaii.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk.
The question from Senator Schatz is directed to the House managers. And also from Senator Feinstein. If the president were acting in the interest of national security, as he alleges, would there be documentary evidence or testimony to substantiate his claim? If yes, has any evidence like that been presented by the president's counsel?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Thank you, Senators, for the question. The answer is yes. There are well-established processes, mechanisms, and agencies in place to pursue valid and legitimate national security interests of the United States, like the National Security Council, like the National Security Advisor, as in Ambassador John Bolton, and many other folks within the State Department and the Department of Defense. And as we have well established over the last week, none of those folks, none of those agencies that would have been involved in having that deliberation, reviewing that evidence, having that discussion, were incorporated into any type of interagency review process during the vast majority of the time that we are talking about here. From the time of the president's call on July 25th to the time the hold was lifted, those individuals, those agencies were in the dark. They didn't know what was happening. And more so, not only were they in the dark, but the president violated the law by violating the Impoundment Control Act to execute his scheme. None of that suggests a valid, legitimate policy objective. More so, the president himself and his counsel is bringing at issue the question of documents and witnesses. If over and over again, as we've heard in the last few days, that the president was simply pursuing a valid, legitimate policy objective, if this was a specific debate about policy, a debate about corruption, a debate about burden sharing, then let's have the documents that would show that. Let's hear from the witnesses that would show that, because the documents and the witnesses that we have forwarded, that we have talked about, show the exact opposite. So the American people in this chamber deserve to have a fair trial. The president deserves to have a fair trial. In fact, if he is arguing that there is evidence, that there was a policy debate, then I think everybody would love to see those documents, would love to see the witnesses, hear from them directly about what exactly was being debated.
Thank you, Mr. Manager.
Mr. Chief Justice,
Senator from South Carolina.
I sent a question to the desk for myself and Senator Cruz.
Thank you. Senator Graham and Senator Cruz pose this question for the House managers. In Mr. Schiff's hypothetical, if President Obama had evidence that Mitt Romney's son was being paid $1 million per year by a corrupt Russian company, and Mitt Romney had acted to benefit that company, would Obama have authority to ask that that potential corruption be investigated?
Well, first of all, the hypothetical is a bit off because it presumes that in that hypothetical that President Obama was acting corruptly, or there was evidence he was acting corruptly with respect to his son. But nonetheless, let's take your hypothetical on its terms. Would it have been impeachable if Barack Obama had tried to get Medvedev to do an investigation of Mitt Romney, whether it was justified or unjustified? The reality is, for a president to withhold military aid from an ally, or an hypothetical to withhold it to benefit an adversary, to target their political opponent was wrong and corrupt. Period. End of story. And if you allow a president to rationalize that conduct, rationalize jeopardizing the nation's security to benefit himself because he believes that his opponent should be investigated by a foreign power, that is impeachable. Now, if you have a legitimate reason to think that any U.S. person has committed an offense, there are legitimate ways to have an investigation conducted. There are legitimate ways to have the Justice Department conduct an investigation. I would suggest to you that for a president to turn to his Justice Department and say, I want you to investigate my political rival, taints whatever investigation they do. Presidents should not be in the business of asking even their own Justice Department to investigate their rivals. The Justice Department ought to have
was a lot of fucking meat too.
Desires of the president.
Yes, I'm riding a bicycle out.
Circumstances of the current presidency is you do have a president of the United States speaking quite openly, urging his Justice Department to investigate his perceived enemies. That should not take place either. But under no circumstances do you go outside of your own legitimate law enforcement process to ask a foreign power to investigate your rival where you think there's cause or you don't think there's cause. And you certainly don't invite that foreign power to try to influence an election to your benefit. It's remarkable to me that we even have to have this conversation. And our own FBI director has made it abundantly clear, and it shouldn't require an FBI director to say this, that if we were approached with an offer of foreign help, we should turn it down. We should, of course, certainly not solicit a foreign country to intervene in our election. And whether we think there's grounds or we don't, the idea that we would hold our own country's security hostage by withholding aid to a nation at war to either damage our ally or help our adversary because they will conduct an investigation into our opponent, I can't imagine any circumstance where that's justified. And I can't imagine any circumstance where we would want to say the President of the United States can target his rival, can elicit foreign help in an election, can help him cheat, and that's okay. Because that will dramatically lower the bar for what we have a right to expect in the President of the United States, and that is they're acting in our interests. So I would say it's wrong for the President of the United States to be asking for political prosecutions by his own Justice Department. I would say it's wrong for the President of the United States to ask a foreign power to engage in investigation of his political rival, but particularly where, as we have shown here, there is no merit to that investigation is even more egregious. And you know there's no merit to it because he didn't even want the investigation. And the more accurate parallel, Senator, would be if Barack Obama said, I don't even need you, Russia, to do the investigation. I just want you to announce it. Because that betrays the fact there was no legitimate basis because the president didn't even need the investigation done. He just wanted it announced. And there's no legitimate explanation for that except he wanted their help in cheating the next election.
The senator from Michigan.
Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk.
Hi, baby girls. What you doing?
The question from Senator Peters is for the House managers. Does the phrase "or other high crimes and misdemeanors" in Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution require a violation of the U.S. Criminal Code, or is a breach of public trust sufficient? Please explain.
What do we got in here?
Framers were very clear that abuse of power is an impeachable offense. In explaining why the Constitution must allow impeachment, Edmund Randolph warned that, quote, the executive will have great opportunities of abusing his power. Alexander Hamilton described high crimes and misdemeanors as offenses which proceed from the abuse or violation of some public trust. The framers also described what it meant. It was impeachable for a president to abuse his pardon power to shelter people he was connected with in a suspicious manner. Future Supreme Court Justice James Iredell said the president would be liable to impeachment if he'd acted from some corrupt motive or other, or if he was willfully abusing his trust. As was later stated in a treatise summarizing centuries of common law, abuse of power occurs if a public officer entrusted with definite powers to be exercised for the benefit of a community wickedly abuses or fraudulently exceeds them. So when the framers said this, that abuse of power was impeachable, it wasn't just an empty, meaningless state. Remember, the founders had been participating with overthrowing the British government, a king who was not accountable. They incorporated the impeachment power into the Constitution late, actually, in the drafting of the Constitution. They knew that they were giving the president many powers, and they specified if he abused them, that those powers could be taken away. Now, the prior articles that the Congress has had on impeachment did not include specific crimes. President Nixon was charged with abusing his power, targeting political opponents, engaging in a cover-up. Now, there was conduct specified. Some of it was clearly criminal, some of it was not. But it was all impeachable because it was corrupt and it was abusing his power. In the House Judiciary Committee, we had witnesses called by both Republicans and Democrats. And the Republican-invited constitutional law expert, Jonathan Turley, testified unequivocally that it is possible to establish a case for impeachment based on a non-criminal allegation of abuse of power. Every presidential impeachment, including this one, has included conduct that violated the law, but each presidential impeachment has included the charges directly under the Constitution. It's important to note that a specific criminal law violation was not in the minds of the founders, and it wouldn't make any sense today. You could have a criminal law violation.
Okay, there's that.
You could deface a post office box. That would be a violation of federal law. We would laugh at the idea that that would be a basis for impeachment. That is not abuse of presidential powers. It might be a crime. And yet you could have activities that are so dangerous to our Constitution that are not a crime that would be charged as an impeachable offense because they are an abuse of power. That's what the framers worried about. That's why they put the impeachment clause in the Constitution. And frankly, they opine that because of the impeachment clause, no executive would dare exceed their powers. Regrettably, that prediction did not prove true, which is why we are here today, with President Trump having abused his broad powers to the detriment of our national interest for a corrupt purpose, his own personal interests. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Mr. Chief Justice.
Oh, Senator, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. I send a question to the desk on behalf of myself and Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Senator. Senators ask counsel for the president. Describe in further detail your contention that all subpoenas issued prior to the passage of House Resolution 660 are an exercise of invalid subpoena authority by the House committees.
Mr. Chief Justice, thank you, senators, for that question. As I explained the other day, this contention is based on a principle that has been laid out in several Supreme Court cases, explaining that the Constitution assigns powers to each house of the legislative branch, to the House of Representatives or to the Senate. And in particular, the language of the Constitution is clear in Article 1 that the sole power of impeachment is assigned to the House. That's to the House of Representatives as a body. It's not assigned to any committee, to a subcommittee, or to any particular member of the House. And in cases such as Rooney versus United States and United States versus Watkins, the court has been called, there are disputes about subpoenas. They're not specifically in the impeachment context, but they establish a general rule, a principle, that whenever a committee of either body of Congress issues a subpoena to someone, and that person resists the subpoena, the courts will examine what was the authority of that committee or subcommittee to issue that subpoena. And it has to be traced back to some authorizing rule or resolution from the House of Representatives itself, for example, in a House subcommittee. And the courts will examine, the Supreme Court has made clear that that is the charter of the committee's authority. It gets its authority solely from an action by the House itself. That requires a vote of the House, either to establish the committee by resolution or to establish by rule the standing authority of that committee. And if the committee cannot trace its authority to a rule or a resolution from the House, then its subpoena is invalid. And the Supreme Court's made clear in those cases such subpoenas are null and void because they're ultra vires. They're beyond the power of the committee to issue. They can't be enforced. And our point here is very simple. There is no standing rule in the House that provides the committees that were issuing subpoenas here under the leadership of Manager Schiff the authority to use the impeachment power to issue subpoenas. Rule 10 of the House defines the legislative jurisdiction of committees. It doesn't mention the word impeachment even once. And so no committee under Rule 10 was given the authority to issue subpoenas for impeachment purposes. And this has always been the case in every presidential impeachment in the history of the nation. There has always been a resolution from the House first to authorize a committee to use the power of impeachment before it attempted to issue compulsory process. So in this case, there was no resolution from the House. The authority, the sole power of impeachment remained with the House of Representatives itself. And Speaker Pelosi, by herself, did not have authority merely by talking to a group of reporters on September 24th to give the powers of the House to a particular committee to start issuing subpoenas. So the subpoenas that were issued were invalid when they were issued. And then 5 weeks later, on October 31st, when the House finally adopted House Resolution 660, that authorized from that point, purported to authorize at least from that point, the issuance of subpoenas. Nothing in that resolution addressed the subpoenas that had already been issued. It didn't even attempt, it didn't purport to say the ones that have already been issued, we're going to try to retroactively give authority for that. It's a separate question whether that could have been done legally. They didn't even attempt to do it. And this is all explained in the opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel, which is in our trial memorandum attached as Appendix C. And it's a very detailed and thorough opinion, 37 pages of legal reasoning, but it explains all of this. The basic principle that applies generally, the history that it has always been done this way, that there's always in every presidential impeachment been an authorizing resolution from the House, and the fact that there was none here, so there was no authority for those subpoenas. And that means that 23 subpoenas that were issued were invalid. And this was explained, as I pointed out the other day, in letters from the administration to the committees. A letter from the White House, from OMB, I think the State Department, and in very specific terms it set out this rationale. So that is the basis on which those subpoenas were invalid, and they were properly resisted by the administration. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk.
Thank you. The question is directed to the House managers. In Federalist 65, Alexander Hamilton writes that the subjects of impeachment are, quote, those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men or, in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust, end quote. Could you speak broadly to the duties of being a public servant and how you believe the president's actions have violated this trust?
Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate. President Trump used the powers of his office to solicit a foreign nation to interfere in our elections for his own benefit. Then he actively obstructed Congress in his attempts to investigate his abuses of power. These actions are clearly impeachable. The key purpose of the impeachment clause is to control abuses of power by public officials. That is to say, conduct that violates the public trust. Since the founding of the Republic, all impeachments have been based on accusations of conduct that violates the public trust. When the framers wrote the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, they intended to capture the conduct of public officials like President Trump, who showed no respect for their oath of office. President Trump ignored the law and the Constitution in order to gain a political favor. The Constitution and his oath of office prohibited him from using his official favor to corruptly benefit himself rather than the American people. That's exactly what the president did, illegally withholding military aid and a White House meeting until the president of Ukraine committed to announcing an investigation of President Trump's opponent. In the words of one constitutional scholar, if what we're talking about is not impeachable, then nothing is impeachable. This is precisely the misconduct that the framers created the Constitution, including impeachment, to protect against. And now I want to add, in reference to some of the comments that were made by some of the president's counsel a few minutes ago. They talked about the subpoena power, about the failure of the House to act properly in the subpoena power, because they said the House did not delegate by rule, have a resolution authorizing the committees to offer subpoena power. They apparently haven't read the fact that the House has generally delegated all subpoena power to the committees. That wasn't true at the time of the Watkins case. It wasn't true 15 years ago, but it is true now. Second, the House has the sole power of impeachment, and the manner of its exercise may not be challenged from outside. Whether we do it, whether the president should be convicted upon our accusation is a question for the Senate. But how we reached our accusation is a matter solely for the House. Thirdly, they talk about executive privilege. And they point to the Nixon case that established executive privilege, that the president has a right to private, to candid advice, and therefore executive privilege is established. But the same case says that executive privilege cannot be used to hide wrongdoing. And in fact, President Nixon was ordered in that case to turn over all the material. Thirdly, there's the doctrine of waiver. You cannot use executive privilege or any other privilege if you waive it. The moment President Trump said that John Bolton was not telling the truth when he said that the president told him of the improper quid pro quo, he waived any executive privilege that might have existed. He cannot characterize a conversation and put it into the public domain and then claim executive privilege against it. The president, by the way, never claimed executive privilege, ever. He has claimed instead absolute immunity, a ridiculous doctrine that the president has absolute immunity from any questioning by the Congress or by anybody else, a claim rejected by every court that has ever considered it. And finally, the difference from this president and any other president claiming privilege of any sort is that this president told us in advance, I will defy all subpoenas. Whatever the nature, I will make sure that the Congress gets no information. In other words, I am absolute. The Congress cannot question what I do because I will defy all subpoena. I will make sure they get no information, no matter what their rights, no matter what the situation. That is the subject of Article 2 of the impeachment because that is a claim of absolute monarchical power.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. The Majority Leader is
I
recognized.
suggest after two more questions on each side, one more, I've been corrected, as I frequently am. One more question on each side, we take a 15-minute break.
Thank you.
Mr. President.
Yes, the Senator from Kansas.
I sent a question to the desk for the Council for the President.
Thank you. Senator Roberts asks, would you please respond to the arguments or assertions the House managers made in response to the previous questions? Directed to the Counsel for the President.
Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate, I want to respond to a couple. First, with regard to the question or the issues that have been raised as it relates to witnesses. It's important to note that in the Clinton impeachment proceeding, the witnesses that actually gave deposition testimony were witnesses that had either been interviewed by deposition in the House proceedings, grand jury proceedings, and it was specifically, Sid Blumenthal, Vernon Jordan, and Monica Lewinsky. The new witnesses were not being called. That's because the House, in their process, move forward with a full investigation. That did not happen here. There was another statement that was raised by Mr. Chairman Schiff, Manager Schiff, regarding the Chief Justice could make the determination
what do we got
on
here?
executive privilege.
Bones
And again,
out.
with no disrespect to the Chief Justice, the idea that the presiding officer of this proceeding could determine a waiver or the applicability of executive
There's
privilege
the bones.
would be quite a step. There's nothing historic precedent, there's no historic precedent that would justify it. But there's something else. If we get to the point of witnesses, then, for instance, if one of the witnesses to be called were by the president's lawyers was Adam Schiff, in the role basically of Ken Starr. Ken Starr presented the report, made the presentation before the House of Representatives, had about 12 hours of questioning, I believe. That's what Judge Starr had. If Representative Schiff was called as a witness, would in fact then issues of speech and debate clause privilege
Actually,
litigated and decided by the presiding officer?
I put new spikes down, I forgot.
Or maybe they would waive it. But those would be the kind of issues that would be very, very significant. Senator Graham presented a hypothetical, which Manager Schiff said, well, that's not really the hypothetical, but hypotheticals actually are that. They're hypotheticals. But I'll give you, to use Manager Schiff's words, he talked about it would be wrong if the FBI or the Department of Justice was starting a political investigation of someone's political opponent. And I'm thinking to myself, but isn't that exactly what happened? The Department of Justice and the FBI engaged in an investigation of the candidate for President of the United States when they started their operation called Crossfire Hurricane. He said it would be targeting a rival. Well, that's what that did. He said it would be calling for foreign assistance in that. Well, in the particular facts of Crossfire Hurricane, it has been well established now that, in fact, Fusion GPS utilized the services of a former foreign intelligence officer, Christopher Steele, to put together a dossier, and that Christopher Steele relied on his network of resources around the globe, including in Russia and other places, to put together this dossier, which then James Comey said was unverified and salacious, but yet it was the basis upon which the Department of Justice and the FBI obtained FISA warrants, and this was in 2016, against a rival campaign. So we don't have to do hypotheticals. That's precisely the situation. But to take it an additional step, this idea that a witness will be called, if this body decides to go to witnesses, that a witness will be called, would be a violation of fundamental fairness. Of course, if witnesses are called by the House managers through that motion, well, the President's Counsel would have the opportunity to call witnesses as well, which we would. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice.
Thank you, Counsel. Senator?
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk. Thank you.
Question from Senator Harris is for the House managers. President Nixon said, quote, "When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal," end quote. Before he was elected, President Trump said, quote, "When you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything," end quote. After he was elected, President Trump said that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him, quote, "the right to do whatever he wants as president," end quote. These statements suggest that each of them believed that the president is above the law, a belief reflected in the improper actions that both presidents took to effect their re-election campaigns. If the Senate fails to hold the president accountable for misconduct, how would that undermine the integrity of our system of justice?
Chief Justice, Senators, I think this is exactly the fear. I think if you look at the pattern in this president's conduct and his words, what you see is a president who identifies the state as being himself. When the president talks about people that report his wrongdoing, for example, when he describes a whistleblower as a traitor or a spy, the only way you can conceive of someone who reports wrongdoing as committing a crime against the country is if you believe that you are synonymous with the country, that any report of wrongdoing against the president, the person of the president, is a treasonous act. It is the kind of mentality that says under Article 2 I can do whatever I want, that I'm allowed to fight all subpoenas. Now, counsel has given a variety of explanations for the fighting of all subpoenas. They might have a plausible argument if the administration had given hundreds of documents but reserved some and made a claim of privilege, or the administration has said we'll allow these witnesses to testify, but with these witnesses, with these particular questions, we want to assert a privilege. But of course, that's not what was done here. What we have instead is a shifting series of rationales and explanations and duplicitous arguments, some made in court and some made here. You have the argument that the subpoenas aren't valid before the House resolution, and then with respect to subpoenas issued after the House resolution, like to Mulvaney, well, those are no good either. You have the argument made that we have absolute immunity, and the court that addresses this says, no, you don't. You're not a king. That argument may be thought of with favor by various presidents over history. It has never been supported by any court in the land. There's no constitutional support for that either. Documents that are being released right now as we sit here, and it's a mystery to the country, and it's a mystery to some of us, how are private litigants able to get documents through the Freedom of Information Act that the administration has withheld from Congress? If they were operating in any good faith, would that be the case? And of course the answer is no. What we have instead is, we're going to claim absolute immunity even though the court says that doesn't exist. Now, they said, well, the House withdrew the subpoena on Dr. Kupperman. Why would they withdraw the subpoena on Dr. Kupperman when he was only threatening to tie you up endlessly in court? Now, we suggested to counsel for Dr. Kupperman that if they had a good faith concern about testifying, if this was really good faith and it wasn't just a stratagem to delay, if it wasn't just part of the president's wholesale fight all subpoenas, they didn't need to file separate litigation because there was actually a case already in court involving Don McGahn on that very subject that was ripe for a decision. Indeed, the decision would come out very shortly thereafter. And we said, let's just agree to be bound by what the McGahn court decides. Well, they didn't want to do that, and it became obvious once the McGahn court decision came out, because the McGahn court said there's no absolute immunity. You must testify. And by the way, if you think people involved in national security, i.e. Dr. Kupperman and John Bolton, if you're listening, if you think you're somehow absolutely immune, you're not. So did Dr. Kupperman say, well, now I have the comfort I needed because the court has weighed in? The answer is, of course not. Now, counsel said, well, we might have gotten a quick judgment in Kupperman. Yeah, in the lower court. Do any of you believe for a single minute they wouldn't appeal the Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court? And the Supreme Court struck down the absolute immunity argument. They wouldn't be back in the district court saying, okay, he's not absolutely immune anymore, but we're going to claim executive privilege over specific conversations that go to the president's wrongdoing. Okay, that is the sign of a president who believes he is above the law, that Article 2 empowers him to do anything he wants. And I'll say this, if you accept that argument, you accept the argument that the President of the United States can tell you to pound sand when you try to investigate his wrongdoing, there will be no force behind any Senate subpoena in the future. The fighting all subpoenas started before the impeachment. If you allow a president to obstruct Congress so completely in a way that Nixon could never have contemplated, nor would the Congress of that day have allowed, you will eviscerate your own oversight capability. Not
Thank
just
you,
impeachments.
Majority Leader is recognized.
I suggest that we resume at 4 o'clock.
Without objection, so ordered.
And there you have it. President Trump's impeachment trial has gone to the question and answer stage of this, which was a lively back and forth where members of the United States Senate got to write their questions on a card like this. It looked like they had been transcribed so the Chief Justice could read them and not be forced to read their handwriting on the back. And that led to a lively back and forth. Nancy Cordes is on Capitol Hill. And Nancy, what did you take away from what happened this afternoon?
Well, Nora, so many of these questions went right at the major controversy that is roiling the Senate right now, and that is whether or not to call witnesses in this trial. Why didn't the House go to court to compel some of these witnesses to testify? Why did the White House block them from testifying and refuse to hand over documents? If the Senate does now try to compel those witnesses to testify, like John Bolton, like Mick Mulvaney, how long will that take? What kind of precedent will that set? So it gives you a lot of insight into what senators are working through right now as they try to figure out whether or not to vote to hear from those witnesses.
And Nancy, this morning on that question of witnesses, we're hearing from Republicans now that it looks less likely that they may hear from witnesses. Do you think anything changed that today?
You know, we are still on the razor's edge. There are 3 Republicans who have said that they are leaning very strongly towards voting to hear from witnesses, and you've got all the Democrats. And so if you have just one more Republican who says that they want to hear from witnesses, then that's the game. They'll have the votes they need. But it's that hunt for that 4th Republican that is proving very difficult for Democrats. There is a shrinking pool of undecided Republicans for them to choose from. And one of them, Cory Gardner of Colorado, just announced a short time ago that he is not going to vote to hear from witnesses. So the question is, among those undecided senators, is there anyone who is still truly on the fence rather than simply waiting to make their announcement that they don't favor hearing from the witnesses, they don't want to drag this trial out any longer, they want to go ahead and make a final vote on whether to remove this president or allow him to stay in office.
All right, Nancy Cortez from The Hill, and I know, Nancy, you will have a full wrap-up on tonight's CBS Evening News, so Nancy, thank you. Let's bring in our panel, John Dickerson, our senior political analyst, and 60 Minutes, Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes, CBS News political analyst Reince Priebus, who is President Trump's first chief of staff, and CBS News contributor and former Democratic advisor Jamal Simmons. Welcome to all. Some housekeeping. They just went about 2.5 hours, so there's 13 and a half hours left of questions. As someone did the numbers, if you go about 5 minutes apiece, you could have as many as 192 questions. We're through 26 of them. And to anybody questioning whether it would be dull or not, the first question out of the gate, the Republican leader, I think, gave to those 3 senators who have suggested they want to have witnesses. Senators Collins, Senators Romney, Senators Murkowski, all asking the Trump legal team if there was more than one motive for Trump's conduct in Ukraine, should the Senate still consider the Biden pressure abuse of power? And as Nancy said, that's at the heart of this. What are we supposed to believe? Is it abuse of power? Is that enough to learn more? Do we need to hear from Bolton? Is this enough to remove him from office?
Right, and the president's team's argument is if there's one drop of a rationale for this that's in the national interest, then even if the rest of it is in his personal interest, you can't impeach it. Of course, the managers say exactly the opposite. One drop of ill intent, one drop of putting yourself above the country, and it's impeachable. It seems like the House managers want to drive all roads to Bolton, which is let's get him in here. He can answer the final questions. The president's defense want all roads out of this, which is to give Republicans a reason not to vote for the witnesses. If the argument is about witnesses, that's good for the president. If the argument is about the president, that's good for the managers.
In fact, that's exactly what Adam Schiff, the House manager, said. Leslie, he said, if you have any question about motivation, well, you need to hear from the man who heard it firsthand. If it was a factor, part of the factor, there's one witness. He's a subpoena away. His name is John Bolton. And don't wait until March 17th when his book comes out. You can hear from him now.
Well, you know, what struck me was the tone. In the Republicans choosing Patrick Philbin to answer almost all of the questions, they chose someone who was respectful. There was no sense of a circus, which you could have expected. And the same on the other side. The arguments were good on both sides. And whenever one or the other side was speaking, you were shaking your head. You're saying, that's a good argument, that's a good argument. I'm not sure who convinced those people who were on the fence one way or the other. It was a fascinating debate. I have to say, thinking in the beginning that there wouldn't be follow-up questions, that's basically what there were. Follow-up. And the tone and the respect shown really was wonderful.
You could tell that there was historic. Yeah, that's a really good point. And you could tell there was coordination between the teams and the Senate leadership, because when there was an opportunity, when they wanted further clarification, the next senator's question would say, "Would you like to respond to what the other side just said?"
Well, I also am starting to see this look like it's winding down into a slow spiraling conclusion and ultimate death. And one of the things that I think everyone needs to keep in mind when watching all of this is the ultimate question that every senator sitting there is thinking of. Are there really 20 Republican senators that are going to remove President Trump from office during the ballot in 2020 after almost 10 states' filing deadlines have already passed? The answer to that is almost certainly no. And therefore, I think you have to answer that question first, and then go analyze whether or not the senators are going to add witnesses to a trial that they know is going to certainly end without a removal of the president. I don't see it. I think that this will be concluded by the end of the week, and they will acquit the president, and this will be the end of it.
This is, of course, the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. I'm saying that's the political. As you say, 10 filing states have already gone through. In fact, I spoke with someone today who said, my absentee ballot is already in the mail for the primary.
Were you going to force the party to go to a contested convention because 20 said it's just never going to happen?
After all of this, can the Republicans running for office around the country go out and say the president did nothing wrong? Can they run on that?
Well, if they're in that position, they can. Some people will say that, and some people will say, hey, maybe I wouldn't have done it that way, but certainly we're not going to remove a president 9 months before an election. The other problem Schiff's got is that he keeps going back to Bolton, but the biggest problem he's got is that he never subpoenaed John Bolton. He didn't. He issued one subpoena for the entire investigation and then withdrew it. They started with quid pro quo, then they went to bribery, and if you read Title 18 of the U.S. Code, which is where all the possible criminal charges could be, there's no criminal charge of abuse of power.
Most legal analysts will tell you that is the fatal flaw that the House managers made, that they did not move forward with the subpoenas, because certainly the Supreme Court has been in their favor, that they would have, based on precedent, would have forced the White House to allow not only Mulvaney, but Bolton and others to testify.
Well, the political flaw here is that the president keeps putting up ideas about what he did and why he did it, and then those ideas keep getting crumbled by facts that come tumbling out into the public sphere. And even while we're sitting here, we're getting facts that are coming out. We're finding out the White House was slow-rolling Bolton's book, and they told him, no, you have to, there's national security problem here. You've got to fix these chapters. And maybe that's the reason why we're starting to see some of these things. You know, I interviewed Jim Clyburn today for The Hill, and he said that he thought it was preordained. So people agree with you on this question, it's preordained. But then you see Schiff today, and Schiff makes a very compelling point. The president understands leverage. The one lever that Congress has over the president is impeachment. And should that mean that we should not ever impeach a president in the first term of his service, because the Senate may not go along with it, or because the public won't get a chance to have a vote?
You know, the important question here is, did the president abuse his power? John Bolton is the person who can answer that. So that's why he's important, even if this is pre-cooked. But there's a political question, too. Republican senators, it seems to me, there are shoes in the closet about to drop. And some of them have dropped since this impeachment trial has been going on. And don't they have to make a calculation? If I don't vote for witnesses, when those other shoes drop, somebody's going to be able to say to me, you know, you had a chance to hear about those shoes before they dropped, and you chose not to do it. Won't that be the challenge for them? Leaving it apart, the president, whether he faces primaries and all that, that seems to me to be the political risk for any senator who's calculating whether or not to allow witnesses or not.
Right now, Lenny Parnas is walking around the Senate, like doing interviews in the hallway, dropping new information.
Well, don't forget, you bring up an interesting question. I think for many of these senators, that's where the knife's edge is. But also, don't forget, even if you're Susan Collins in Maine or you're Cory Gardner in Colorado, you still have a president on the ballot, a Republican that's at 95% approval rating in the party. You don't think that Cory Gardner or Susan Collins or Martha McSally is not going to get crushed by the Republicans in their states if they vote to remove or even look disloyal on the witness issue? And so then what are they going to do? You're going to have a primary, and then you're going to, on your own side, and if the filing date's passed, what, are you going to have a write-in campaign? I mean, it is going to be a fiasco.
Well, she's calculated, nevertheless, that she's going to vote for witnesses. So, you know, what's really interesting, too, is that in the other impeachments before, at least in our time, Nixon and Clinton, there was a special prosecutor working at the same time, calling witnesses. The grand jury was investigating, and that testimony was sent over to the Congress. And you don't have that here. And it changes the dynamic. I remember in Watergate, some of the people who were involved were being indicted, prosecuted, sent to jail, while this was all going on at the same time. So it's a difference. You can't go back and talk about witnesses in the past.
We'll just make
it's
it all.
confusing.
I want to bring in Weijia Zhang, who is at the White House, who's been reporting on the pressure campaign and the lobbying that the White House has been engaged in with a number of these undecided senators or senators who may also be up in tough re-election races this year. Weijia?
And Nora, that is exactly the point that the White House is making, at least one of them, as they send their message to these senators. To Reince's point that, you know, this could be opening Pandora's box if you allow witnesses. So who knows how long this could drag on and waste a lot of time that could go toward, you know, achieving other things that they can run on, when in the end the conclusion is going to be the same. They argue that the president is going to be exonerated, and then all those Republicans who might vote for witnesses have to deal with a disgruntled president who's not going to support them. And we know the sort of power that Mr. Trump can have when he goes to stump for them as they try to win re-election. They're also arguing that what's at stake is the tool of executive privilege. And they warn that it could be damaged if these high-profile witnesses who are close to President Trump, who are part of his inner circle, are called to testify, that all of a sudden you would have a different set of rules when it comes to that privilege if there is a trial and during other times. And so, you know, the White House is really trying to make their case. The president, we are told, has not personally reached out to any of these senators, but certainly members of his team are in constant communication with Mitch McConnell, who is talking to those people. And I think it's important to know what happened today. That letter that we saw from the White House to Bolton, effectively blocking him from publishing his book because they cite it contains matters of national security and some information that is labeled top secret. You know, that's not just about his manuscript. That's about teeing up their case as they try to block Bolton as a potential witness. And it is important to note that the White House says that letter was dated on January 23rd. That's 3 days before the public learned about what was in this Bolton manuscript. Of course, the top line is that he says Mr. Trump told him that the Ukrainian military aid was linked to investigations of the Bidens. So all that to say, the White House is very aware of this pressure campaign. They are trying to get the votes, and I did speak to the chief of staff for the vice president this morning, and he's cautiously optimistic, but even he says he really doesn't know what's going to happen until Friday. Nora?
All right, Weijia, thank you. You know, long gone are the days of LBJ on the phone or Bill Clinton, who used to ring senators after midnight. You know, that I can remember as a cub reporter for Roll Call being one of the first to report that Hillary Clinton was calling members of the House to lobby on behalf of her husband during impeachment. Now the president doesn't really need to pick up the phone. He has another means to do it.
Right. That's what Reince was saying. He has Twitter, which is a huge anvil.
I would say that the president is constantly on the telephone. I've never seen a person be willing to continue to talk and talk and talk.
He's a talker.
I mean, senators call nonstop, and he calls them back. I wouldn't be surprised if the president is on the phone. But, you know, I think that what you're seeing at this point in this hearing is a political exercise that each senator is evaluating, in that how much of this do I need to keep putting up with in order to look reasonable back home. And each state has a different sliding measure to what that amount is. And so ultimately, I think that's what this is coming down to, and I agree.
Purely a political meter, or is there a moral meter that exists?
Well, I think there's a moral meter, but I think the conclusion that most Republicans everyone that I know of generally fits in the box of, regardless of what you think of the accusation, even if the accusation is true, is it enough to remove a president? And their answer is going to be no. Go ahead.
We're also past the age of having Joe Lieberman, who went to the floor of the United States Senate and just trashed Bill Clinton for a whole speech on the floor of the Senate and talked about all the things that he did wrong, all the ways that it was a bad idea for the Republic in the White House and the way you govern. And then said, but I don't think it's impeachable and the president should be removed from office. But the president of the United States won't give these Republicans the ability to have any moral standing and then go back to their people and say, yes, I think what the president did was wrong. However, I think we should keep him. But that would be the best argument for all of them, but maybe he won't let them do it.
But maybe, just maybe, back in Wisconsin, back in Minnesota, people don't care. Just maybe we're living in a bubble where we think that every little play called from scrimmage, every single person's watching, every person cares. Trump's latest 3 polls on approval rating was Rasmussen 49, Fox 45, Emerson 47. His approval rating's gone up since all of this has started.
But the thing is, they're elected to care. And they're elected to care one way or the other.
But they're elected to also represent their constituents. And if they're saying you're wasting time, you're not getting anything done.
What I'm saying is they're elected to care. And if they want to make the case that the president is perfectly innocent, which is the president's position, or they want to say it was wrong but not impeachable, or it's impeachable, that's fine. But making that choice is what they're called to do. And it seems to me the tension here is if you say, well, it was wrong, but it's not impeachable, you then have to sign up for all the things the president has done in defense of his position of perfection, which is he said it was perfect, which means that you're saying that was not true, and he's gone after a lot of these witnesses and attacked them, and you're on the hook for that.
But what's the remedy? I mean, if assuming everything you said is true, what's the remedy? Removal from office? Or just a continuing charade?
Okay, so...
Right. Earlier I had said the perfect compromise is the censure that allows the Republicans to say he did something wrong, but it's not impeachable, and it allows the Democrats to say, okay, let the voters decide. And it gets all these different senators who are facing difficult races in both parties to get off the hook.
You know, it's not just the senators, it's also the president. And when we think about what happened with President Clinton back in 1998, remember Bill Clinton went on television and admitted that he had done things wrong. I think the American people are a very forgiving lot. The problem is when you don't ask for forgiveness. You don't give the American people the out to say, you know what, we don't like what you're doing, but we're not willing to let you go. And you don't help your allies and friends who also want to make the same case. I think when you hold the line so far, the president of the United States clearly is doing things that people don't like, not just in this case, but in many others. It's presenting people with choices, either signing up for everything or signing up for none of it.
But don't forget, as Ron said, his ratings are going up. During this whole proceeding, he's getting stronger, as Bill Clinton did during his. And, maybe the public is more fed up with this than we think.
There's also a Democratic constituency within the United States Senate which would also like for this to end. It's not just a Republican constituency. It's the Democrats, the 4 Democrats who are running for president of the United States, including the ones who are strongest on the ticket, including Sanders, Warren, and Klobuchar. And then there are the more moderate Democrats who, as well, do want to focus on other issues. And it is true that my understanding that this would gum up the Senate for another at least 4-5 weeks as they wait for a decision from the courts about a subpoena.
And the president's lawyers sure were concerned about the Senate schedule and how much longer they would have to be there. I've never seen an executive branch care so much about Senate time as in this defense, which is basically saying, you want witnesses, it's going to be long and drawn out, you're going to have to sit here. I mean, that was an appeal to their backsides and basically saying, if you continue this, you're going to be here a lot longer and you're already there.
There is one. The other argument that you hear Schiff making so passionately, right? So much of their argument has been so meticulous and prepared upon. The passion is if you let the president, you don't impeach him, you are saying he is above the law. That's why the Democrats saved that final question for Kamala Harris, where she brought up Nixon. The idea that if you allow this to happen, there will be no force behind Senate subpoena power in the future, and this president will be above the law, and he will continue to behave as if he's above the law.
Except Pelosi said that in order to impeach, it had to be bipartisan and overwhelming, and it wasn't. The aid was released, and the meeting happened without condition.
The debate continues, as will the questions, and our coverage will continue on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or on our CBS News app. There will be more on your local news on this CBS station, and we'll have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening.
I'm Tanya Rivero in New York, continuing our CBSN special report. The impeachment trial of President Trump is still in a break. Senators have spent the last 2.5 hours asking questions to both the president's legal team and House managers. But this is all taking place amid a fight over new witnesses in the trial. Last night, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said he did not have the votes yet to block Democrats from calling witnesses. The demand for new testimony comes after revelations from the president's former national security advisor, John Bolton. He reportedly claims in an upcoming book that Mr. Trump conditioned aid to Ukraine on investigations into the Bidens. The White House sent a letter to Bolton's lawyer threatening to block the book from being published. It reads, quote, under federal law and the non-disclosure agreements your client signed as a condition for gaining access to classified information, the manuscript may not be published or otherwise disclosed without the deletion of this classified information. With that, let's bring in our panel, Molly Cooper and Rebecca Roiphe. Molly is a CBSN political contributor, and Rebecca is our legal contributor. So, Rebecca, from a legal perspective, does the White House have the ability to block Bolton's book from being published? Will Bolton's lawyers now sue over parts of the book that they would like to block?
They cannot block the book from being published. Bolton has a First Amendment right to publish his thoughts and opinions. They can block pieces of the book that they claim contain national security secrets, but that process is normally done in back and forth, and this administration is clearly more assertive in the way that it deals with executive privilege type claims or national security type claims, so they may make this claim, but they're not going to win.
Right. So, Molly, it's interesting, though, that the White House letter to Bolton's lawyer and publisher was dated 3 days before that New York Times article when everyone became aware of Bolton's manuscript. What does that timing tell you?
Well, now I don't know the back matter, but it seems a little suspicious. I mean, here's a guy who wants to publish a book in several weeks. Ostensibly, he wants a bestseller, and he doesn't want the White House to tell him no, he can't publish it.
Well, he certainly has a bestseller now. I mean, the pre-orders are through the roof, but yeah.
That's right. And also the First Amendment argument is key. But again, the timing, you're right. It is, it's strange.
But it also tells us that the White House knew about this manuscript earlier than everyone thought.
Well, that's true. At least the NSC did.
Right.
And I think that what will be interesting is to hear which Democrats, or when the Democrats ask the question of the White House counsel, what did you know about this manuscript before you came and made your arguments to us in the Senate against impeaching the President of the United States and against calling John Bolton as a witness? They haven't asked for that yet, but I mean, we're only a few hours in, and they have 16 hours, and perhaps you want to save those questions for the end.
A lot of questions to come, a lot of questions we heard today. Rebecca, from a legal perspective, how do you feel, the House managers and the President's counsel handled the questions directed at them today?
I think they handled them well. I mean, I think each side has its point that it's hammering. Some are more successful than others. I think that it would be great if they could settle on their most persuasive arguments. I think that the White House has a good argument in saying what's the limiting principle. If you can impeach a president for abuse of power, then couldn't we just impeach every single president? What's the limiting principle here? And I think the Democrats, the House, have very good points too. If you can't impeach for anything that's not criminal, we could have a president who moved to Saudi Arabia and decided to play video games, right? He couldn't be impeached. You could have somebody who fired every single Jewish employee in the government, and he couldn't, that's not a crime. He couldn't be impeached. Obviously, when you take this to its extreme, it makes no sense. And I think one of the questions to Dershowitz was, which he replied yes, was, look, if a president thinks that he is the country, that the country's interest is just having him as president forever, if he were to cheat on the election, could you impeach him? And Dershowitz said no.
You know what? We have that soundbite. Let's listen.
But if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment.
So, Rebecca, is that a valid legal argument? I guess what Republicans are trying to say is that, yes, maybe he did pressure the Ukraine to look into corruption. It was also in the public interest, but it was also in President Trump's
So I think the mixed motive is actually a really good argument. I think the idea that a president could have a mixed motive, like I could say, you know what, I'm gonna try to do this to the economy that will help me get elected, but it's also in the American, I'm going to, have my Fed raise the interest rates. That's good for the country, and it's good for me because I'll get reelected. That, I think, that's a good argument.
Right.
But when they push it, because here this isn't what the House managers have argued. They've argued this was directly against, contrary to our established country's interest. And so when you push Dershowitz here, it makes no sense.
And lead impeachment manager Adam Schiff responded to Dershowitz's argument. Let's listen to what he said.
The next president of the United States can ask for an investigation of you. They can ask for help in their next election from any foreign power. And the argument will be made, nope, Donald Trump was acquitted for doing exactly the same thing. Therefore, it must not be impeachable.
So is that an argument that's likely to resonate with any Republicans?
Ooh, it's a tough one because, even Jay Sekulow came back and said, hey, guess what? Something like that did happen, except for it was with our own government, and they were spying on the president, President Trump, his campaign. Now, again, whether you believe that or not, but that's an argument that Sekulow came back with. And over the years, senators, like Senator Graham says, that he's had the FBI listening to him on his phone calls, and that he has been surveilled by foreign countries. So it does resonate, it does hit close to home, but again, whether it's going to move the needle...
Where the fuck do these bears keep coming from?
That's a different matter.
An interesting part of the day, I thought, was when they, Adam Schiff brought up this idea of flipping it on its head, right? And asked senators, well, if President Obama had asked the president of Ukraine to investigate Mitt Romney, would that have been appropriate, right? And then, one of the questions that Republican senators came back with was, well, if Mitt Romney's son had procured a job in the Ukrainian government that was,
This is one thing that I think is interesting, which is...
Oh, I'm so sorry. Just as this was getting good, we have to cut you off and go back and listen into the Senate floor. That's Chief Justice Roberts.
Mr. Cipollone, as members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, we listened intently when Manager Crow was defending one of Senator Schumer's amendments to the organizing resolution last week, as he explained how he had firsthand experience being denied military aid when he needed it during his service. As you know, David Hale, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, confirmed that the lethal aid provided to Ukraine last year was future aid. Which would you say had the greater military impact? President Trump's temporary pause of 48 days on future aid that will now be delivered to Ukraine, or President Obama's steadfast refusal to provide lethal aid to Ukraine for 3 years, more than 1,000
books. I don't want that.
Ukraine attempted to hold back Russia's invasion and preserve its sovereignty.
Those working stiffs.
Mr. Chief Justice, thank you, senators, for that question. And I think it was far more serious and far more jeopardy for the Ukrainians, the decision of the Obama administration to not use the authority that was given by Congress, that many of you all and many members of the House of Representatives voted for, giving the U.S. government the authority to provide lethal aid to the Ukrainians, and the Obama administration decided not to provide that aid. And multiple witnesses who were called in the House by the House Democrats testified that the United States policy towards Ukraine got stronger under the Trump administration, in part largely because of that lethal aid. Ambassador Yovanovitch, Ambassador Volker, others also testified that U.S. policy in providing that aid was greater support for Ukraine than was provided in the Obama administration, particularly the provision of Javelin anti-tank missiles, which they explained were lethal and would kill Russian tanks and change the calculus for aggression for the Russians in the Donbass region in the eastern portion of Ukraine, where that conflict is still ongoing. In terms of the pause, the temporary pause on aid here, the testimony in the record, put aside what the House managers have said about their speculation, and they know what it's like to be denied aid. The testimony in the record is that this temporary pause was not significant. Ambassador Volker testified that the brief pause on releasing the aid was quote unquote not significant. And Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs David Hale explained that quote, this was future assistance, not to keep the Army going now. So in other words, this isn't money that had to flow every month in order to fund current purchases or something like that. It was money, it's 5-year money. Once it's obligated, it's there for 5 years. And it usually takes quite a bit of time to spend all of it. So the idea somehow that during the couple of months in July, August, and up till September 11th, 55 to 48 days, depending on how you count it, that this is somehow denying critical assistance to the Ukrainians on the front lines right then is simply not true. And now the House managers have tried to pivot away from that because they know it's not true, and to say, no, it was the signal to the Russians. It was the signal of lack of support that the Russians would pick up on. But here again, it's critical. Even the Ukrainians didn't know that the aid had been paused. And part of the reason was they never brought it up in any conversations with representatives of the U.S. government. And as Ambassador Volker testified, representatives of the U.S. government didn't bring it up to them because they didn't want anyone to know. They didn't want to put out any signal that might be perceived by the Russians or by the Ukrainians as any sign of lack of support. It was kept internal to the U.S. government. They pointed to some emails that someone at the Department of Defense or Department of State, where Cooper received from unnamed embassy staffers, suggesting that there was a question about the aid. But her testimony was she couldn't even remember what the question really was, and she didn't want to speculate. There's not evidence that any decision makers in the Ukraine government knew about the pause. And just the other day, another article came out, I believe it was from at the time, the Foreign Minister Daniluk, explaining that when the Politico article was published on August 28th, there was panic in Kiev because it was the first time they realized there was any pause on the aid. So that was not something that was providing any signal either to the Ukrainians or the Russians because it wasn't known. It was 2 weeks later after it became public that the aid was released. The testimony in the record is that the pause was not significant. It was future money, not for current purchases. And it was released before the end of the fiscal year. They point out that some of it wasn't out the door by the end of the fiscal year. That happens every year. There's some percentage that doesn't make it out the door by the end of the year. And again, it's 5-year money. It's not like it's all going to be spent in the next 30, 60, 90 days anyway. So the fact that there was a little fix, Congress passed a fix to allow that $35 million to be spent. Something similar happens for some amount almost every year, and it was not affecting current purchases. It wasn't jeopardizing anything at the front lines. There's no evidence about that in the record. The evidence is to the contrary. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel.
Mr. Chief Justice.
Senator from Maine?
Mr. Chief Justice, I have a question for both sets of counsel, which I'm sending to the desk.
Question from Senator King is for both counsel to the President and the House managers. President Trump's former Chief of Staff, General John Kelly, has reportedly said, quote, "I believe John Bolton," end quote, and suggests Bolton should testify, saying, quote, "If there are people that could contribute to this, either innocence or guilt, I think they should be heard," end quote. Do you agree with General Kelly that they should be heard? I think, counsel for the President, it's your turn to go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate. This was a bit of a topic that I discussed yesterday, and that was the information that came out in the New York Times piece about what is purportedly in a book by Ambassador Bolton. Now, as I've said, the idea that a manuscript is not in the book, there's not a quote from the manuscript in the book, this is a perception of what the statement might be. There have been very forceful statements, not just from the President, but from the Attorney General. The Department of Justice stated that while the Department of Justice has not reviewed Mr. Bolton's manuscript, the New York Times account of this conversation grossly mischaracterizes what Attorney General Barr and Mr. Bolton discussed. There was no discussion of, and this again, personal favors or undue influence on investigations, nor did Attorney General Barr state that the President's conversations with foreign leaders were improper. So again, that goes to some of the allegations that were in the article. The Vice President said the same thing. He said in every conversation with the President and Vice President in preparation for our trip to Poland, the President consistently expresses frustration that the United States was bearing the lion's share of responsibility. There's also an interview that Ambassador Bolton had given, I think in August, about the conversation where he said it was a perfectly appropriate conversation. I think that information's publicly available now. So again, to move that into a change in proceeding, so to speak, I think it is not correct. The evidence that has already been presented, a accusation that if you get into witnesses, I'll do this very briefly, if we get down the road of the witness issues, let's be clear. It should not be, I certainly can't dictate to this body, it should certainly not be, though, that the House managers get John Bolton and the President's lawyers get no witnesses. We would expect if they're going to get witnesses, we will get witnesses, and those witnesses would then, but all of that, just to be clear, changes the nature and scope of the proceedings. They didn't ask for it before.
Thank you, counsel.
Senator, Justice, what's the significance of the President's former Chief of Staff saying that he believes John Bolton and implicitly does not believe the President, that Bolton should testify? It's really, at the end of the day, not whether I believe John Bolton or whether General Kelly believes John Bolton, but whether you believe John Bolton. Whether you'll have an opportunity to hear directly from John Bolton, whether you have the opportunity to evaluate his credibility for yourself. Now, there are a few arguments made against this. Some are rather extraordinary. It would be unprecedented, the suggestion, I think, is to have witnesses in a trial. What an extraordinary idea. But as my colleagues have said, it would be extraordinary not to. This will be the first impeachment trial in history that involves no witnesses if you decide you don't want to hear from any, that you simply want to rely on what was investigated in the House. That would be unprecedented. Yes, we should be able to call witnesses, and yes, so should the President. Relevant witnesses. Now, the President says that you can't believe John Bolton, and Mick Mulvaney says you can't believe John Bolton. Well, let the President call Mick Mulvaney. another relevant witness with firsthand information. If he's willing to say publicly, not under oath, that Bolton is wrong, let him come and say that under oath. Yes, we're not saying that just one side gets to call witnesses, both sides get to call relevant witnesses. Now, they also make the argument implicitly, this is going to take long, Senator's got to warn you, if you go on a real trial, it's going to require witnesses, and that's going to take time. And I think the underlying threat, and I don't mean this in a harsh way, but is we're going to make this really time consuming. The deposition took place very quickly in the House. We have a perfectly good Chief Justice behind me that can rule on evidentiary issues. What's more, the President has waived and waived and waived any claim about national security here. By talking about himself, by declassifying the call record. We're not interested in asking John Bolton about Venezuela or other places or other countries, just Ukraine. And if there's any question about it, the Chief Justice can resolve. These are relevant questions to the matter at hand. What you cannot do is use privilege to hide wrongdoing of an impeachable kind and character.
Manager. Senator from Utah.
Send a question to the desk on behalf of myself and Senators Cruz and Hawley.
The question is directed to Counsel for the President. Is it true that Sean Misko, Abigail Grace, and the alleged whistleblower were employed by or detailed to the National Security Council during the same time period between January 20, 2017 and the present? Do you have reason to believe that they knew each other? Do you have any reason to believe that the alleged whistleblower and Misko coordinated to fulfill their reported commitment to, quote, do everything we can to take out the president, end quote?
That's a good question.
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, the only knowledge that we have, that I have of this, comes from public reports. I gather that there is a news report in some publication that suggests a name for the whistleblower, suggests where he worked, that he worked at that time while detailed the NSC staff for then Vice President Biden, and there were others who worked there. We have no knowledge of that other than what's in those public reports, and I don't want to get into speculating about that. It is something that, to an unknown extent, may have been addressed in the testimony of the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community before Chairman Schiff's committees, but that testimony, contacts with the whistleblower, contacts between members of Manager Schiff's staff and the whistleblower are shrouded in secrecy to this day. We don't know what the testimony of the ICIG was. It remains secret. It has not been forwarded. We don't know what Manager Schiff's staff's contact with the whistleblower have been and what connections there are there. It's something that would seem to be relevant since the whistleblower started this entire inquiry.
Well, what's cooking?
But I can't make any representations that we have particular knowledge of the facts suggested in the question. We know that there was a public report suggesting connections and prior working relationships between certain people. Not something that I can comment on other than to say that there's a report there. We don't know what the ICIG discussed. We don't know what the ICIG was told by the whistleblower. Other public reports about inaccuracies in the whistleblower's report to the ICIG. We don't know the testimony on that. We don't know the situation of the contacts, coordination, advice provided by Manager Schiff's staff to the whistleblower. That all remains unknown. But something that obviously, to get to the bottom of motivations, bias, how this was all, this inquiry was all created, could potentially be relevant. Thank you.
Thank you, Counsel. The senator from New Mexico.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send a question to the desk for the President's Counsel.
Oh shit.
When did the President's Counsel first learn that the Bolton manuscript had been submitted to the White House for review? And has the President's Counsel or anyone else in the White House attempted in any way to prohibit, block, disapprove, or discourage John Bolton or his publisher from publishing his book?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and thank you, Senator, for the question. At some point, I don't know off the top of my head the exact date. The manuscript had been submitted to the NSC for review. It is with career NSC staff for review. The White House Counsel's Office was notified that it was there. The NSC has released a statement explaining that it has not been reviewed by anyone outside NSC staff. In terms of the second part of the question, has there been any attempts to prevent its publication or to block its publication? I think that there was some misinformation put out into the public realm earlier today, and I can read for you a relatively short letter that was sent from NSC staff to Charles Cooper, who is the attorney for Mr. Bolton, on January 23rd, which was last week. Which says, "Dear Mr. Cooper, thank you for speaking yesterday by telephone. As we discussed, the National Security Council Access Management Directorate has been provided the manuscript submitted by your client, former Assistant to President John Bolton, for pre-publication review. Based on our preliminary review, the manuscript appears to contain significant amounts of classified